Good morning. It is really good to be with you guys once again. I am thoroughly enjoying this time together. As I always do, I have a question for you this morning. You ready? Have you now you laugh like that's something funny. Have you ever known someone who has suddenly stopped what they were doing and completely changed directions in their lives? Have you ever known anybody like that? I've known a few, myself included. Maybe it's something that you've encountered yourself. When I read this passage from Luke this past week, I could not help but hear my own call story and the call story of many of my friends in seminary and beyond ringing in my ears. And the thing is that my story is a little bit different than many of those that I was surrounded with in seminary. And the reason is that for most of my closest colleagues, their story went something like this. One day I discovered that God was calling me into ministry, and I said, yeah, no, not happening. And I resisted for many years. In fact, I had a friend in seminary who resisted for over 40 years before she pursued seminary. The interesting thing is, my story is way different than those with whom I was surrounded. Most of them resisted for a period of time. They didn't want to hear God's call. It was either for a few moments or a few years of their lives. But regardless, it was like, how many of you ever had this experience in your lives where a parent actually took you to a pool or a lake or a pond and said, okay, here you go, right? And pushed you in? My father would have done that to me if my mother hadn't said, no, you're not doing that. The thing is there's something to that, right? I mean, we hear that sink or swim analogy a lot, right? We hear that coming through in many aspects of life. And there's those that I was surrounded with who, like me, took that initial step and jumped in feet first, hoping that as soon as my toes hit the water, I would be able to start treading water, right? I didn't want to have to go into the water before I figured it out. But there are multiple people who don't do those kind of things. They take their time, they explore. I wish I was like that some days, but that's not who I am. But as I read through these people who did things like this, whether it was in ministry or other aspects of life, I ran across one that was very similar to how I answered my call to ministry. This is a story about Marcy, who at the age of 50 made the momentous decision to leave her job, her home, her friends, everything she knew, her family, and her career, so that she could go study medicine to work with the poor of Central America. Now imagine that. You are established. As I read this story, she was an artist, a painter who sold her artwork for thousands of dollars in galleries across the country. Her life was established. She had everything that she could possibly imagine and dream of. She had social networks that supported her through everything that she did. She had a comfortable routine. How many of us love our routines? She had a reputation. She had wealth. She knew who she was, where she was, and where she was going, or at least she thought. She had made it in her life. She had it all. Now, the part of the story that captivated me was the story about a conversation that she had with one of her close friends about her decision. And at one point in the story, Marcy told her friend about this decision to go back to school to become a doctor, and was reflecting on her decision saying, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go to medical school. And that was the first time that she had spoken those words aloud. She had just announced a huge life change. I mean, think about it. How many of us would like to be our own bosses throughout most of our careers? Right? Be able to set our own schedule, to do the things we wanted to do, when we wanted to do them, to go off and shop if we wanted to, or go to the park if we wanted to. And now she was putting herself in a position where she was going to need to spend and focus her attention on something that may not necessarily have been what she wanted. She had spent some weeks in quiet discernment and listening. But in this sacred space with her friend, she sensed what God wanted for her life. And then, shedding all of the fear that most of us wear 90% of the time we're in public, she began to take the steps into this new life. She was following a vision. Moreover, she was listening to God. Now, I'm hoping that, like me, you're wondering what caused this shift in her life. And here's what she had to say. I wish I had this response to my family and friends when I told them I was going into seminary, because most of them went, "You're doing what?" But here's what she said. It's not about right now. It's about the long haul. The long haul. When you think about those particular words, it presents itself as a quaint little phrase, doesn't it? I mean, we think about the long haul for a lot of things in life, don't we? What is it that we want to do beyond what's happening today? It brings up these images in my mind, only because this is what my father used to watch all the time, but the images of the old wagon trains, right, traveling across the country. Or maybe for those of us who don't have those experiences, maybe you think of long-haul truck drivers, people who travel extensively. It brings up these visions of mountain treks and ongoing struggles. I imagine black and white images of Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn traveling down the great old Mississippi on that handmade raft. The long haul. But I wonder, what does it mean to consider the long haul in our work and in our relationships, or even our relationship with God, our faith journey? What comes to mind when we think about the big picture in terms of how we live out our lives in the world of today? And as we reflect on this piece of Luke's gospel message, we see a Jesus who is thinking about the long haul, right? I mean, he's standing in Jerusalem and he's being confronted. It doesn't matter if the police are coming to arrest him and ultimately torture and kill him. He is committed to the work of ministry, and neither soldiers nor politicians will stop him in his trek. And when he's warned of immediate and imminent danger, he says, "Go tell that fox I'll be right here today, tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, and the day after that." In other words, he's saying, go tell Caesar what you want to tell him. It doesn't matter. I'm in this for keeps, and I'm not going anywhere. If he wants to come get me, he can find me, because I'll be right here. In one sense, this is about Jesus throwing down that glove of challenge to his adversary. But in another deeper sense, it's about an abiding commitment to stay the course, to continue in his faith, to take the long haul. You see, for Jesus, the call to be in Jerusalem was a long haul kind of thing, wasn't it? I mean, this was the end for him. It wasn't the beginning. This was the end. It's not unlike changing one's life to change or to attend school, medical school at the age of 50, or to go into seminary at the age of 33 after having established yourself as an accountant for many years. It's about commitment and keeping on the path that's laid out before you. And it seems to me that words and actions like what Jesus said in this passage take courage and clarity, don't they? I mean, think about that. How many of you, after 15 years of working, would have been willing to drop everything that you were doing, leave your home, your family, and your friends, and go off and do something in a strange place, in a strange world, and strange people? That's what this is about. Imagine yourself stopping right now in this moment, deciding that you know what God is calling you to do. Imagine knowing God's purpose for your life, and no matter what happens, this is what you're going to do. You're going to do it now, not later, when it's more convenient. Whether it's staying put in Jerusalem to heal the sick, heading to a town you've never been to before to study theology and the Bible for the first time in your life, or even heading to Central America to work among people who are less fortunate, who may not speak the same language and definitely have a different culture than you do. The long haul says that you will not be deterred in what you are doing. I mean, I'm living proof that you can drop everything that you have and what you're doing to follow God's prompting. I've done it a couple of times in my life. But in today's world, we all have our own challenges, right? We have a lot of challenges in our way of doing and being. And so really at this point, we need to ask ourselves a really important question. What are we doing to take a stand in today's world in the shadow of Jesus and dare those coming up against us in this world? I mean, think about it this way. God has brought you here in this space, in this moment. This is who you are. This is the right thing to be doing right now, and this is the moment to be doing it. So what's it like to stand on the solid ground of commitment? How are you feeling in this moment, knowing that you are exactly where you're supposed to be? What is it like to have the gift of clarity about God's claim on your life? Don't get me wrong. The prospect of standing up to those who stand against you is both wonderful and terrifying, right? I mean, how many of us have ever stood up to a bully in their lives? Right? It's terrifying. But it's wonderful at the same time when you realize that you were able to have the courage and the strength to do so. That's physicalness of this world. And so let me ask you this question. How many of us have ever taken the time to actually sit and discern God's call in our lives? How many of us have simply stepped out as typical with business as usual to take stock of our lives and maybe do something different? How many of us have ever journeyed in the wilderness of our own hearts where we meet the absolute truth and then have to face it about who we are and who God calls us to become? I'm not challenging us to attempt to become like Jesus. Jesus is Jesus. There will never be another Jesus until he returns, right? That's what we believe. But we are called to be fully ourselves, to stand up for what is right. And it's the discovery of that core reality that I hope becomes a part of our regular Lenten journeys together. You see, sometimes preparing for the long haul also means pacing ourselves, right? I mean, it's not about taking a sprint and running that 50-yard dash. God knows I couldn't do a 50-yard dash if I wanted to. But it's about running the long haul, the long race. It's important not to confuse a wise, measured stride, right? How many of you run? Does anybody run? This body is not designed for running. I'm asking because I really want to know, right? But if everything that I've been taught about running is you figure out what is an appropriate pace and stride to run the distance you need to go. And that's what this is about too. You don't want to take too many long strides that end up compromising your long race. You don't want to take too many short steps that you run out of energy and strength and courage to continue on. But it is about being able to take the right pace, the right stride, to continue to step forward into a future that God has in store. Gearing up for the long haul doesn't mean melding into a background of meaningless chatter. It means taking the time to be deliberate. It means taking care and focusing our attention. It means lasting, persistent, stubborn commitment. Now, most of us know what stubborn commitment is, yes? All right, good. In this time of temptations to get out into the world, to get out into the sunshine, the sun that is actually coming out at this moment, the strange weather that we experience right now at this time of year, between the ultimate cold and the ultimate hot, somewhere in the middle, but also that weariness that comes from not knowing what to expect in each day, and definitely the burnout that many of us feel. In these days of frenzy and overwork, in a season of broken promises and unmet commitments, each one of us is beckoned and called, begged by the Holy Spirit to take a moment, to stop, to reflect. And when we do, to allow ourselves to be open to what it is that God is really telling us in that moment. to seize that perpetual moment, to put our hands together, to listen in prayerful silence for the wonder of God's claim on our lives, but also not to stay there and become stagnant either. We are literally touched by God's desire every moment, and particularly in this moment, by God's deep love for and longing for each of us, for a relationship, for community. It's all here now. In grace and in hope, in understanding and in compassion, in authenticity and in power, this Lenten moment touches us. So as we prepare for God's ultimate sacrifice in Jesus' death on the cross, let us shed that intensity of life's ultimate distraction and begin to listen. Listen for the voice of the holy, that gentle, challenging, comforting call to keep on keeping on. Because God knows this world needs people who are willing to stand up, just as Jesus did, to keep doing what is right. So are we ready to hear, to listen, and not just stop there, but to actually step forward in faith, knowing that God is directing us to act?